Life inside a British home between 1955 and 1960 was simple, disciplined and shaped by the memory of the war. Houses were small, streets were quiet, families lived with routines that came from habit and necessity. Subscribe to the channel today for more stories about Britain's homes between 1955 and 1960. Most families lived in terraced houses, with narrow hallways and cold floors. Coal dust settled on windowsills. The kettle stayed on the hob all day. The BBC Home Service played in the background. The smell of damp coats hung near the back door. Rationing had officially ended in 1954, but the habit of saving every penny remained. People wasted nothing. Housewives reused jars. Children learned that warmth came from a single coal fire in the living room. Many families still dealt with the effects of post-war shortages. Timber was limited. New materials were expensive. Prefabs from late 1940s housing schemes were still occupied. They felt temporary, yet people made them feel permanent with curtains, polished floors and painted walls. Post-war Britain taught families how to make small spaces work. That lesson shaped the way people thought about rent, value and the idea of home. The neighborhood mattered as much as the house. Streets had corner shops, a butcher, a greengrocer and the local chemist. Children played on pavements, watched by neighbors leaning on low brick walls. An Austin Morris or a Ford Zephyr passing down the road was an event. Traffic was light. People knew every sound on their street. Council estates were growing fast, especially on the edges of cities. They offered indoor bathrooms, larger kitchens, and new heating systems. This growth prepared the country for the housing expansion that defined the early 1960s. Daily routines were predictable. Morning began with the rattle of the letterbox. The milkman arrived early. Mothers prepared tea while boilers coughed into life. The house warmed slowly. Families gathered in small kitchens lit by fluorescent tubes. Evenings meant cleaning ash from the fireplace and drying laundry on racks above it. These habits taught discipline, order and responsibility. They formed the quiet education of everyday life. These homes shaped expectations about rent. Money was tight, but people believed that housing should be steady and affordable. The average worker knew exactly what part of the weekly wage would go to rent. Families studied rent books, with the same attention used for school reports. The structure of daily life created a deep understanding of value and cost. It also prepared families for the changes of 1960, when rent prices seemed manageable and predictable. British housing in this period was a mix of tradition and slow modernization. You still saw smog drifting between chimneys in winter. You still heard coal lorries on Saturday mornings, but new ideas were entering the home. People bought electric irons, radios with better reception and patterned wallpaper inspired by mid-century design. Every improvement signaled progress. It showed that Britain was moving from austerity toward comfort. This mix of old habits and new possibilities shaped how families viewed their homes in 1960. They lived in modest spaces, but believed in stability. They expected rents to remain fair. They trusted the system of council housing. They believed that the future would offer more space, better heating, and modern layouts. This is where our story begins. Understanding the daily life inside these homes explains why the rent prices of 1960 feel unbelievable today. It shows how living standards, expectations, and community ties influenced the entire housing market. Growing up in Britain between 1955 and 1960 meant learning early that space was limited and precious. Children understood the size of their world by the width of a terrace hallway or the length of a narrow backyard. Bedrooms were shared, cupboards were small. Every object had a place, every meter mattered. Families lived with a discipline built into the walls of the home. Most children in cities lived in terraced houses built before the First World War. These homes had tight staircases, thin internal walls, and small front rooms used only on special occasions. The living room served as the main family space. Furniture was arranged carefully to avoid blocking the fireplace. Parents stored winter coats on hooks under the stairs. Toys were kept in boxes to prevent clutter. Order was not decoration. Order was survival in small rooms. Council estates offered slightly more space, but not much. Many estates built in the 1950s followed strict post-war design rules. Kitchens were compact, bathrooms were upstairs, storage cupboards were shallow. Children learned to share everything. They shared bathtubs, desks, and radio time. This sharing shaped how families understood privacy and how they adapted to limited square footage. It also showed why affordable rent was essential for stability. Outdoor space was limited too. Back gardens were short and functional. They held washing lines, dust bins, and small vegetable patches. Council blocks had shared drying areas. Children used narrow alleys as play spaces. These spaces taught them how to move, negotiate, and cooperate. Streets were extensions of the home. Pavements became football pitches. Parking was minimal, so cars like the Austin A30 or the Ford Popular stayed outside only when necessary. Inside the home, families made small improvements to stretch every corner. Mothers added shelves over doors. Fathers built cupboards from leftover timber. Wallpaper covered imperfections. Mid-century design made rooms look brighter and more open. Simple changes gave families a sense of control. These efforts made the house feel larger than it was. They also demonstrated the creativity required to live comfortably in limited space. This daily experience built a strong understanding of value. Children listened as parents discussed rent in the kitchen. They heard how each shilling mattered. They watched mothers compare prices at the local shops. They saw fathers set aside money for the weekly rent payment. Homes taught financial discipline because space and money were deeply connected. If rent increased, families risked losing the little room they had. The scarcity of space also shaped expectations for the future. Families dreamed of larger homes in new suburbs. They imagined indoor heating systems that warmed every room. They hoped for modern estates with wide windows and better insulation. These hopes set the tone for how people viewed the housing market in 1960. When families saw rent prices that matched their wages, they saw opportunity and stability. Understanding how children grew up in these small homes explains why 1960 rent felt fair and attainable. Space was tight, but expectations were low enough to match reality. Homes were modest, but they represented security. Each square meter shaped behavior, priorities, and dreams. And this shaped how families approached renting in the years to come. By the late 1950s, Britain faced a crowded and competitive housing market. Families waited years for a council house. Young couples lived with parents long after marriage. The demand for new homes grew faster than the supply. The pressure pushed families to think carefully about every choice they made. Moving up the housing ladder required patience, discipline, and luck. Council housing lists were long in most towns. Local authorities received constant requests from returning servicemen, new families and workers, moving from industrial areas. Applicants filled forms at municipal offices and waited for letters that rarely came quickly. Some families waited more than 5 years for a 2-bedroom flat. Others accepted older properties on estates built before 1940 because newer blocks had long queues. The government built new council estates across the country. Many were on city edges where farmland met expanding suburbs. These estates offered indoor bathrooms, wider streets and better insulation. They promised a modern lifestyle. Demand was overwhelming. Families visited show homes during open days and imagined fresh starts. Children ran through empty rooms. Parents inspected kitchen tiles and boiler cupboards. Every detail mattered because people understood how rare these opportunities were. Suburban growth accelerated at the same time. Developers built rows of semi-detached houses with driveways and small front gardens. These homes targeted families who could pay modest mortgages. The idea of moving out to the suburbs symbolized progress. It meant leaving overcrowded terraces and starting a life shaped by space, privacy, and cleaner air. Commuting became normal. Buses connected new estates to high streets. Rail lines supported workers traveling from emerging commuter towns. Saving for a deposit was difficult. Wages increased slowly. Prices of building materials rose with inflation. Many households relied on weekly budgeting. Mothers tracked expenses in notebooks. Fathers worked overtime. Every extra shilling went into savings tins. The effort was quiet and constant. There were no guarantees. Still, families believed in the long-term goal. Owning a home became part of the national identity. The housing ladder had clear steps. The first step was securing a stable rental, usually in a council estate. The next step was saving enough for a deposit on a small suburban semi. The final step was maintaining the property, improving it through modest DIY and paying the mortgage on time. This process shaped expectations. It defined adulthood and family responsibility. Crowding in the housing market made even small opportunities feel significant. A letter offering a council flat was life-changing. A chance to view a reasonably priced house in a new estate felt like winning a competition. Families talked about housing prospects during Sunday lunches. Children heard the discussions and understood the importance of stability. This growing pressure set the stage for the rent values of 1960. When families looked at rental prices that matched their wages, they felt relief. Rent seemed manageable compared to the long-term costs of moving through the housing ladder. The balance between income and housing cost felt fair. It allowed families to plan futures with more confidence than in the early post-war years. This silent effort, shared by millions across Britain, shaped how the country viewed renting and owning during this period. It was not just about finding a place to live. It was about finding a place to grow, improve, and eventually rise to the next step. In most British homes between 1955 and 1960, the daily rhythm was defined by meal times. Tea time created structure. Families planned their days around it. The table became the center of order inside the house. The same table also became the place where rent books, utility bills, and weekly wages were reviewed. Food and finances existed side by side. This routine taught families discipline and responsibility. Evening tea was predictable. Mothers prepared bread, margarine, fish paste, or leftovers from Sunday lunch. Children washed their hands at the kitchen sink. Fathers returned home from work with coal dust on their coats or oil on their sleeves. The kettle boiled on the hob. The BBC Home Service played quietly. These small rituals created stability. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew when to sit down. The rent book usually appeared after tea. It was kept in a drawer near the cooker or on the mantelpiece above the fire. The book showed every payment, every date, and every signature from the landlord or the council office. Families treated it with the same seriousness they used for school reports. It represented order, duty, and the need to stay on track. Missing a payment was not an option. Paying rent on time was part of the moral calendar of the home. Weekly wages arrived on Friday. Notes and coins were placed on the table. Mothers divided the money into sections. One portion covered rent, another covered coal delivery, another was for groceries at the local shops. What remained went to repairs, children's school needs, or saving tins. The system was simple but strict. Every family understood it. Children grew up watching it. They learned early that housing costs shaped everything else. Domestic routines supported this budgeting. Clothes were mended instead of replaced. Rooms were heated only when necessary. The coal fire stayed lit in the living room, not in the bedrooms. Electric heaters were used sparingly because they raised the electricity bill. These decisions kept the house running. They also protected the rent money. Stability came from choosing what to prioritize. Rent payments were often made in person. Council tenants walked to local housing offices with their rent books tucked under their coats. Private tenants sometimes paid landlords directly at the doorstep. These interactions reinforced commitment. Paying rent was not just a transaction. It was a moment of accountability. Landlords recognized reliable tenants. Tenants took pride in being dependable. Tea time reinforced this cycle. Families discussed expenses, upcoming bills, and future plans. Children listened as parents decided whether to buy new wallpaper, repair a leaking gutter, or save for a gas cooker. The conversation was calm and practical. Home management was a shared responsibility. This mindset shaped how families evaluated rent prices in 1960. They saw rent as a fixed point in an otherwise uncertain financial landscape. Because of these routines, rent felt fair when it aligned with wages. Families judged value not by square footage alone, but by stability. A home that fit the budget allowed families to maintain routines without disruption. It allowed them to sit down to tea without anxiety. Rent was woven into the structure of daily life. It was part of the rhythm of the home. This connection between routine and cost explains why the rent values of 1960 carried so much meaning. Families saw affordable rent as a foundation for order, comfort, and future planning. It allowed them to live with dignity, even in modest homes. It set the tone for how people approached housing across the country. Families in Britain between 1955 and 1960 accepted the limitations of their homes without question. Most houses were built long before modern standards. Rooms were small, walls were thin, windows were single-glazed. Heating came from one coal fire in the living room. Bedrooms were cold from October to March. Condensation formed on the glass each morning. People wiped it away with towels kept on the radiator. This was normal. No one expected more. In terraced houses, the downstairs layout rarely changed. A narrow front room, a slightly larger back room, and a compact kitchen. Storage was minimal. Cupboards were shallow. Loft spaces were dusty and unfinished. Families adapted by owning fewer possessions. They stacked boxes under beds. They hung shelves in hallways. They used every inch with care. The structure of the house shaped daily behavior. Council estates built after the war improved some conditions, but modestly. New blocks offered indoor bathrooms and better ventilation. Kitchens had stainless steel sinks and built-in larders, yet even these homes had limitations. Heating systems relied on coal or early gas fires. Windows were basic metal frames. Insulation was poor. Tenants knew the flaws, but they also understood the value. Council rent was predictable and affordable, which made the imperfections easier to accept. The lack of modern heating influenced how families arranged their days. Children dressed near the fire in the morning. Parents warmed school uniforms on the back of chairs. Hot water bottles were essential during winter. People closed internal doors to trap heat in single rooms. These habits kept fuel costs under control. Coal was not cheap, and families managed consumption carefully. This frugality helped maintain room in the budget for the weekly rent. Because expectations were low, rent prices in 1960 felt reasonable. Tenants did not compare their homes to modern standards. They compared them to pre-war slums, overcrowded lodgings, or extended family arrangements. A small house with its own bathroom and private front door represented progress. Rent reflected the basic condition of the property. Lower quality meant lower cost, and most families accepted this calculation. Repairs were limited. Landlords fixed structural issues, but many small problems were left to tenants. Drafts came through gaps in skirting boards, floorboards creaked, roof tiles shifted in storms. Families lived with these issues. Some added rugs for warmth, others taped windows or installed heavy curtains to block winter air. DIY solutions were common and practical. This acceptance kept rent stable because landlords invested minimally. People also accepted simple kitchens. Appliances were few: a cooker, a kettle, and, if the family could afford it, a small refrigerator. Many households relied on pantries instead of modern storage. These limitations shaped eating habits and daily routines. They also influenced rental value. Homes with new appliances or improved heating cost more and were harder to secure. The acceptance of modest conditions helped create a shared understanding of what housing was worth. Rent in 1960 reflected an honest relationship between quality and price. Families did not expect luxury. They expected reliability. As long as the home stayed dry, the roof stayed intact, and the fire warmed the main room, the rent felt justified. This mindset formed the foundation of the housing economy of the era. It set the tone for how families evaluated property, saving, and future opportunities. It also explained why rents seemed so manageable at the time. Expectations shaped value, and value shaped the stability of everyday life. By the late 1950s, small home improvements became part of everyday life in Britain. Families wanted cleaner, brighter, and more modern interiors, even if the house was rented. Terraced homes, prefabs, and council flats were treated as starter homes. Tenants knew they might move again, but they still worked to make each space feel better than before. Improvement became a habit. It was practical, affordable, and culturally widespread. Most families began with paint. Mid-century colors filled catalogs in local hardware shops. Soft greens, light creams, and pale blues replaced the dark tones left from earlier decades. Paint dried slowly in cold rooms, so windows stayed open even in winter. Wallpaper became another common upgrade. People bought rolls from Woolworths or local decorators. Patterns were simple: stripes, florals, or geometric shapes inspired by Scandinavian design. Applying wallpaper required patience. Families cleared the table, filled a paste bucket, and worked together. These improvements lifted morale and made rooms feel fresh. DIY tools became more accessible. Small hand drills, saws, and screwdrivers were sold in affordable sets. Fathers kept tools in biscuit tins or wooden boxes under the stairs. Saturday afternoons often meant minor repairs. Loose floorboards were nailed down. Shelves were mounted in bedrooms. Curtain rods were installed in living rooms. Children watched and learned by observing. Practical skills passed from parent to child without formal teaching. Some houses received modest extensions. Lean-to sheds were added behind kitchens for extra storage. Coal bunkers became small utility areas. In suburban semis, families built simple porches to reduce drafts. These changes were rarely architect-designed. They were made with leftover materials, donated timber or items purchased second-hand. Each project added a bit more comfort to limited space. Renters made improvements despite not owning the property. This reflected the mindset of the time. Families saw rented homes as temporary steps. They expected to move upwards when finances allowed. A starter home was not a permanent destination. It was a training ground for managing space, repairing problems, and understanding household routines. Improving the home showed pride and readiness for the next stage on the housing ladder. Council tenants upgraded their spaces too. Some installed better lighting. Others painted doors or used patterned linoleum to cover worn floors. These efforts made basic homes feel modern. Even small changes created a sense of progress. Council estates encouraged this because tenants treated the homes as long-term but not final. Improvement culture grew stronger every year. Shops supported this movement. Ironmongers sold cheap fixtures. Local markets offered affordable fabrics for curtains. Newspapers published DIY guides for basic repairs. BBC programs mentioned new household trends. Advertisements promoted electric irons, modern cookers, and decorative pieces that matched mid-century tastes. The public enthusiasm for improvement grew as wages slowly increased. These upgrades influenced perceptions of rent. Families valued homes that allowed personal improvement. Tenants accepted simple structures, but they appreciated the freedom to decorate. A house that responded well to DIY felt worth its rent. A property that resisted improvement because of damp walls, poor layout, or strict landlords felt less valuable. Improvement became part of the rental equation. This mid-century DIY culture shaped expectations for the housing market. It reinforced the idea that families could rise through effort and patience. Even modest rented homes could feel warm, organized, and personal. Improvement made small spaces livable and rent prices acceptable. It taught families how to manage homes, save money, and plan for future ownership. This attitude guided millions through the late 1950s and into the affordable rental landscape of 1960. In Britain, between 1955 and 1960, families controlled their routines inside the home. Children asked permission to leave the table. They followed strict schedules for meals, baths, and bedtime. Domestic order was clear. Yet, when it came to changing homes, neighborhoods, or entire ways of living, families had far less control. Housing decisions depended on councils, waiting lists, and public regulations. Moving house required patience rather than personal choice. Council housing was the main path to stability. Demand was high and supply was limited. Families applied at local authority offices and received long forms that asked about income, family size, and living conditions. These applications joined large queues that moved slowly. A family could request a two-bedroom flat, but the decision belonged to the council. Some households lived in overcrowded terraces for years while waiting for approval. Prefabs offered another path, but entry into them also depended on allocation. Many prefabs had been built as temporary homes after the war. They had insulation issues and thin walls, but they offered private bathrooms and more modern layouts than older houses. Councils assigned these prefabs according to need. Families did not choose them, they were placed in them. Moving into a prefab felt like progress, but it required official permission, not personal decision-making. New estates appeared around city edges. These sites had clean streets, green spaces, and modern semi-detached houses. They symbolized hope for young families, yet access was controlled by strict priority rules. Veterans, large families, and people living in poor conditions were placed first. Others waited. Viewing a new council house required invitation. Tenants walked through empty rooms only after receiving a letter from the council. It felt like attending an appointment rather than making a private choice. Private renting involved similar limitations. Many landlords preferred stable tenants. Families with children faced more restrictions. Some landlords refused pets. Others limited improvements or required regular inspections. Moving into a private rental depended on availability, references, and timing. A wanted house might disappear before a family had the chance to apply. Competition increased as more people sought better conditions. Moving to a new neighborhood also meant adjusting to local rules and expectations. Each area had its own school catchment boundaries and transport routes. Some streets had strong community involvement, others lacked resources. Families could hope for a better environment, but councils controlled where people lived and for how long. A shift from an inner-city terrace to a suburban council estate required approval that might take months or years. These layers of permission shaped the national mindset. Families learned to negotiate with institutions. They learned to adapt to decisions made by others. They understood that housing was not just a personal matter. It was a public system influenced by national shortages, local budgets, and post-war reconstruction priorities. This created patience, resilience, and deep respect for stability. Because moving house required multiple approvals, staying put became a practical choice. Renters valued reliability above luxury. If a home was dry, affordable, and near work or schools, families often remained despite imperfections. This reduced pressure and kept rent costs predictable. This limited mobility explains why rent in 1960 felt stable and fair. Families did not expect the freedom to move whenever they wished. They expected a system where progress happened slowly, supported by steady payments and good behavior. Housing was a partnership between families and public authorities. This partnership shaped the entire rental culture of the era. In Britain between 1955 and 1960, rent was not just a monthly payment. It was a routine with its own structure, paperwork, and etiquette. Every tenant used a rent book. These small booklets, usually blue or brown, documented every payment with dates, signatures, and brief notes. The book lived in a drawer near the cooker or on the mantel above the coal fire. Families treated it as a formal record, almost like a family document. Losing it was unthinkable. Most rent books were issued by councils or private landlords. Each entry was written by hand, ink smudged on damp days, pages curled from exposure to the heat of the living room fire. Tenants checked the book at the end of each week. Mothers compared entries with wages received on Friday. Fathers confirmed that amounts were correct. Children watched these steps and understood that stability depended on accuracy and routine. Payments were made in person. Council tenants often walked to local housing offices. They joined queues that formed after lunchtime, each person holding a rent book under the arm. Clerks used rubber stamps and fountain pens to confirm payments. The process was efficient but gentle. Staff recognized tenants by name. Conversations were brief and polite. The transaction felt like a civic duty rather than a financial burden. Private rentals involved more direct contact. Some landlords visited homes on Saturdays. Tenants placed the rent book on the kitchen table next to the weekly envelope of notes and coins. The landlord wrote the date, signed the page, and offered a short nod. A good tenant was valued. Regular payment built trust. Many landlords rented out only a few properties and relied on relationships rather than formal inspections. This system created a quiet sense of ceremony. Paying rent meant more than exchanging money. It meant confirming that the family remained steady. It meant that the home was secure for another week. It meant that the routines of the household, washing days, coal deliveries, school mornings, could continue without interruption. Rent books reinforced this security through visible records that families could hold, read, and review. Some households treated rent payments with the same seriousness as thank you letters written after birthdays or holidays. Families felt gratitude for affordable housing. They valued the predictability of payments. Rent in 1960 was low enough to fit into weekly wages. It matched the economic expectations of working-class and lower-middle-class families. Tenants understood that their payments supported maintenance, community services, and the broader housing system. The low cost of rent made the ritual even more meaningful. Families could pay reliably without sacrificing essentials. Council rents were kept steady by government policy. Private rents remained tied to the condition and age of the property. Because homes were simple and modest, rent stayed manageable. The rent book reflected this balance. It showed that the family lived within its means and honored its commitments. The bureaucracy of housing in this period felt calm rather than intrusive. Letters from the council arrived in brown envelopes with simple reminders or updates. Repairs were requested through handwritten notes. Tenants trusted these systems because they experienced them often. The formality did not create distance, it created reassurance. These small bureaucratic rituals shaped how people viewed housing costs in 1960. They saw rent as a stable, predictable obligation. They saw the rent book as a symbol of responsibility and security. They believed that as long as the entries stayed in order, their homes would remain theirs. This mindset formed the foundation for how families valued their houses and planned for the future. Hospitality in Britain between 1955 and 1960 followed rules that were understood without being spoken. Homes were small, but the welcome was large. When a guest arrived, the best chair was offered immediately. The seat closest to the fire was reserved for visitors. Cushions were straightened. The kettle went on the hob. Biscuits saved for special occasions were taken from tins in the cupboard. These gestures reflected pride rather than luxury. They showed that respect mattered more than the size of the home. Most British living rooms were compact. Terraced houses had narrow front rooms used mainly when visitors came. Furniture often included one armchair and a small sofa. The armchair went to the guest. The host took a dining chair from the kitchen or stood for a moment until the room settled. Council flats followed similar patterns. Space was limited, but hospitality remained the priority. A visitor changed the atmosphere of the entire home, even if only for an hour. The presentation of the room mattered. Curtains were drawn evenly. Mantelpieces were dusted. Coal fires were built carefully to burn at a steady glow. These details were signs of good housekeeping. They formed part of the social evaluation of a home. Neighbors, relatives, and colleagues noticed everything. A tidy room suggested discipline. A warm fire suggested care. A well-kept home increased a family's reputation regardless of income. Serving tea reinforced this hospitality. Lyons tea, rich tea biscuits, and fruitcake appeared quickly. Children were told to give up their seats and remain quiet. This created space both physically and socially. Families believed that hosting well reflected the quality of the household. It was a form of social currency. Even if money was limited, generosity was abundant. Small homes made these moments more intimate. Guests sat close to the fire. Hosts moved carefully around furniture. Conversations flowed naturally in tight spaces. These conditions highlighted the contrast between limited room and large hospitality. People understood that warmth came from behavior, not from square footage. A visitor felt welcome even if the front room measured only a few meters across. Homes were judged not just by appearance but by atmosphere. A clean hearth, polished sideboard, and neatly arranged ornaments indicated pride. The state of the home influenced how families were perceived in their street or estate. Housewives took this seriously. They cleaned before visits. They prepared the living room as if expecting an inspection. Social expectations shaped these efforts, but they also strengthened community relationships. Council estates had their own standards. Tenants took care to maintain hallways, gardens, and shared spaces. A well-kept home signaled reliability to neighbors and local authorities. It also reinforced the idea that tenants deserved their place in the estate. Hospitality was part of this reputation. Visitors carried impressions with them, and those impressions traveled through streets, workplaces, and extended families. This culture of receiving guests showed that rented homes were more than temporary shelters. They were expressions of identity and values. Even basic homes reflected stability, discipline, and pride. Families believed that how they treated visitors mattered as much as the home itself. This mindset influenced how people evaluated rent. A home that allowed meaningful hospitality felt worth its cost. The British tradition of offering the best chair revealed the deeper truth of the housing landscape. Space was limited, but dignity was abundant. Renters invested emotionally in their homes. They created comfort where resources were scarce. They used hospitality to show that modest houses could still feel important. This shaped how families valued their homes in 1960 and why affordable rents felt both fair and essential for a stable life. Rent in 1960, Britain bought more than a roof. It bought stability in a country still rebuilding itself. Families lived in modest terraced houses, council flats and early suburban semis. These homes were simple, but they offered private front doors, predictable bills, and neighborhoods that felt secure. Rent aligned with wages. This balance allowed families to plan. It allowed them to save. It allowed them to believe that improvement was possible. Architecture shaped this value. Most homes were pre-war builds with small rooms, single-glazed windows and limited heating. Many council estates built in the 1950s followed standardized layouts with functional kitchens, compact bathrooms, and practical storage. These houses lacked modern insulation, but they were solid. They were dry. They were safe. Repairs were manageable. Families accepted imperfections because they understood the era. Homes were built for practicality, not luxury. Economically, housing costs matched the working world. A single wage from factory work, office clerking, or local trades often covered rent, food, and essentials. The average rent consumed a reasonable portion of income. It did not control the entire household budget. Families could afford coal deliveries, school uniforms, and minor improvements without fear of falling behind. This made rent feel fair and predictable. Culture strengthened this sense of value. Streets were communities. Neighbors shared tools, watched children, and exchanged advice about repairs or rationing leftovers. Many families lived close to their workplaces. Commuting was short. Local high streets offered affordable goods from butchers, bakers, and greengrocers. Social support reduced financial strain. Families felt anchored. Rent secured access to this environment. The housing ladder was clearer. A council flat was a foundation. A rented terrace was a stepping stone. A semi-detached house in the suburbs was a realistic long-term goal. Mortgage rates and house prices aligned with average wages. Saving for a deposit was difficult but possible. This progression shaped generations. It taught people to associate effort with mobility and stability with responsibility. Rent also bought mental space. Families did not fear sudden increases. They trusted councils, local authorities, and long-standing landlords. The rent book was a symbol of this trust. The relationship between income and housing cost felt consistent. This reduced anxiety and created a sense of security that shaped childhood memories and adult expectations. Today, the numbers feel impossible because the entire structure has changed. Wages no longer align with house prices. Rent consumes a far larger share of income. Homes once considered starter properties now cost more than many families can save. Council housing is limited. Waiting lists are longer. Private rentals dominate the market. Stability has become harder to find. Modern homes offer better insulation, central heating, double glazing, and advanced appliances. Yet the economic environment surrounding them is far heavier. Families in 1960 traded comfort for affordability. Today, families trade affordability for basic access. The goals of the housing ladder have shifted. The gap between wages and housing costs has widened across every region. The rent of 1960 purchased a home, a community, and a clear path forward. It allowed generations to build, save, and progress. This combination of modest architecture, a stable economy, and strong social culture made housing feel achievable. That foundation no longer exists in the same form. This is why the rents of the past appear not just low, but unimaginable. Understanding what rent truly offered in 1960 reveals how deeply housing shapes national identity. It shows how stability, space, and affordability built the expectations of an entire era. And it explains why those values feel so distant today.